what if I told you that the most famous story in human history about uh, private personal sin actually has nothing to do with what happens in private?
Right.
I mean, what if for 1,400 years we've just been reading a, a brilliant, hyper-advanced manual on the thermodynamic collapse of civilizations, and we've been mistaking it for, a simple bedtime morality tale?
Yeah, it completely upends everything you think you know about ancient history, sociology, and frankly, the society you're living in right now.
Oh, totally.
Because when you actually strip away the layers of mythology and look at the structural data of this text, you aren't looking at a weeping preacher condemning bedroom behavior.
No.
You're looking at a terrifyingly precise blueprint of a society that basically decides to weld its own intake valves shut.
Right. So if you're listening to this right now, you've probably heard the story of Lot, the city of Sodom, fire and brimstone.
The classic cautionary tale.
Exactly. It's universally understood, across multiple cultures and centuries as the ultimate cautionary tale about sexual ethics. But today, we are throwing that conventional religious sentimentality entirely out the window. We are taking a deep dive into the Quran, specifically Surah 26, verses 160 to 176.
And we're looking at it through the radically structural lens of the 20th century thinker Ghulam Ahmad Parwez.
Right, because Parwez took this ancient text and essentially read it like a systems engineer.
He did. And what he found is going to fundamentally change how you view the rise and fall of empires.
Which is exactly our mission today. I want to make it clear. We are not treating this as theology.
No, absolutely not. There will be no preaching today.
Right. We're cross-referencing Parwez's linguistic analysis with the rigorous, albeit controversial, sociological data of J.D. Unwin.
And the early psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud.
Yeah. We're decoding this narrative as a rigorous treatise on civilizational survival, the management of human energy, and, well, the unavoidable mathematical consequences of cutting off external exchange.
It's pure systems theory.
It is. But, okay, I have to start by playing devil's advocate here.
Sure.
Because if you ask anyone on the street what the story of Lot is about, they'll say, without hesitation, that it's a condemnation of male homosexuality.
Of course. That's the standard reading.
Right. It's treated exclusively as a story about unregulated internal behavior. So how can Parwez, or anyone else for that matter, look at a text that's been interpreted one way for a millennium and say, actually, you're all completely missing the forest for the trees?
Well,
Like, what is the actual evidence for this massive pivot?
to understand that, we have to look directly at the Arabic text itself, specifically verses 165 and 166 of Surah 26.
Okay, let's look at the text.
The text presents a highly specific diagnostic question to this society. Lot asks them, do you approach males from the worlds? And the Arabic phrase here is min al-laymin, and leave what your Lord created for you of your wives.
Min al-alimin.
Right. Now, the traditional reading hyperfocuses on the word males. But Parwez argues that the ultimate structural clue, the master key to the entire pathology of this city, is that phrase min al-laymin.
Min al-alimin, from the worlds, meaning like from all of humanity, from the outside.
Exactly. The text doesn't say, why do you do this with each other in your private homes behind closed doors?
Yeah.
It explicitly states min al-laymin, you are targeting people from the outside world.
Oh, wow.
So the foundational problem being diagnosed by this text isn't simply a matter of unregulated private behavior.
Right, it's an external issue.
Yes, it is the targeted interception and exploitation of outsiders. It is the systemic refusal of productive social exchange with anyone who crosses their borders.
Wait, let me stop you there because that is a massive paradigm shift.
It changes everything.
It really does. If I'm understanding this correctly, the text is basically describing a black hole civilization.
A black hole. I like that.
Yeah, like it's a city that has decided to become a completely closed system. Instead of trading with the outside world, instead of exchanging ideas or goods, they consume anyone who crosses their event horizon. They trap the traveler.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. They have literally weaponized their borders.
Right.
If you think about what a stranger represents to an ancient walled city, a stranger isn't just a person.
No, they're...
A stranger is data. A stranger brings news, trade, new technologies, different cultural perspectives, maybe warnings about droughts or advancing armies.
Yeah, they're the connection to the larger world.
Exactly. A stranger is the intake valve of a civilizational engine. They bring fresh fuel into the system. But the city of Lot decided to turn the stranger into an object of pure exploitation.
So they didn't trade with the worlds.
No, they consume the worlds.
But why express that exploitation in such a specifically visceral, physical way? I mean, if they were just robbing people, wouldn't the text just say, stop stealing from travelers?
Because the physical assault is the ultimate, most horrifying manifestation of absolute domination and extraction.
Okay, I see what you mean.
It is the total negation of the stranger's humanity.
Hmm.
And you have to remember the socioeconomic realities of the ancient Near East. The desert environment is unforgiving. There are no international laws. There are no hotels or, embassies. If you're a traveler crossing the desert, your biological survival entirely depends on the hospitality of the settlements you pass through.
Right, it's literally a matter of life and death. If a city shuts its doors, you die of thirst.
Precisely. So in these ancient systems, how a city treats strangers is the primary diagnostic of its entire social ethics.
That makes total sense.
Let's contrast the two models. First, you have the open system. A city that welcomes strangers, provides them with shelter, guarantees their safe passage.
A functional society.
Yes. This city participates in networks of mutual benefit. By allowing safe passage, they encourage trade caravans, they import fresh information, they build diplomatic alliances. It's a healthy, breathing, open ecosystem.
Like an engine with a clean intake valve. Air comes in, combustion happens, power is generated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have the closed, extractive system, the city of Lot, a city that systematically assaults strangers. A city that turns every visiting outsider into an object of humiliation and physical consumption. They have completely severed their productive exchange. Because,
Yeah.
I mean, think about the immediate economic consequence of this behavior. Who is going to trade with them?
Nobody. The caravans are going to route 100 miles around them. Word gets out.
Exactly. They've built this invisible wall around themselves made of terror and exploitation. It is the extractive community taken to its absolute logical extreme. They become a perfectly sealed box.
And Parwez backs this up linguistically, right? Because when I was looking through the source material, there was a specific word used to diagnose their condition in verse 166.
Yes.
The word is adun.
Right. And this is where the linguistic deep dive becomes crucial. The word adun comes from the linguistic root du. In Arabic, this root means to cross over, to trespass, to violate a proper boundary. The text is diagnosing their social dysfunction not as a private moral failing, but as a structural boundary violation.
But wait, a skeptic might say, well, ad law just means they're breaking God's rules. It's just a generic word for sin. How do we know it specifically means systemic structural exploitation?
Because of how that exact same linguistic root is deployed throughout the entirety of the Quran.
Ah, okay.
This is Parwez's methodology. He doesn't look at words in isolation. He cross-references their usage across the entire text. And the root DW is consistently used to describe economic exploitation, systemic injustice, political oppression, and the violation of treaties.
Oh, wow.
It is fundamentally a word of systemic violence.
So it's not a word you use for someone who, like, just tells a lie or eats the wrong food. It's a word you use for a corporate monopoly that crushes small businesses, or a nation that violently breaks an international ceasefire.
Exactly. It denotes a systemic, normalized overstepping of boundaries that harms others. And Parwez points out that the text explicitly states the community made this an Ichimai germ.
Which translates to what, exactly?
A collective societal crime.
A collective crime.
Yeah. This wasn't a fringe group of criminals hiding in the dark alleys of the city. This was the normalized, institutionalized operating procedure of the entire society. The city as a whole had structured its economy and its social life around the violation of the traveler.
Okay, if you're listening to this on your commute or while you're making dinner, pause and think about the sheer scale of what we are talking about.
It's massive.
We are talking about a civilization that decides to survive entirely by extracting from anyone who comes near it, while simultaneously refusing to offer anything of value in return. It's a parasitic model.
It is deeply parasitic,
Right.
but it's also thermodynamically doomed.
Right.
And this is where the source material brings in the sociological data, which makes this ancient text feel incredibly, almost uncomfortably modern.
Yeah, this part is fascinating.
The lectures cross-reference this ancient diagnostic with the work of J.D. Unwin, specifically his monumental, though often overlooked, 1934 book, Sex and Culture.
Okay, this part of the research totally blew my mind, but I also had a lot of questions about it. Let's dive deep into Unwin's methodology, because at first glance, connecting sexual regulations to the building of aqueducts and the collapse of empires sounds, well, it sounds like Victorian prudishness disguised as science.
It does sound like that.
How did he actually measure this?
It's a very fair skepticism to have.
Yeah.
And Unwin himself actually started his research trying to disprove the idea that sexual morality had anything to do with civilizational success.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was an Oxford anthropologist, not a theologian. He conducted an exhaustive historical and sociological study of 80 civilized nations, including the Romans, the Greeks, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, and 11 primitive tribes.
That's a huge data set.
It is. And he was looking for patterns in how societies manage human energy.
What does he mean by human energy? Because that sounds, a bit mystical. Are we talking about calories?
No, we're talking about psychological and biological drive, the sheer raw biological imperative that powers human action. Unwin found a direct, measurable, historical correlation between a society's structural constraints, specifically how it regulates the immense biological drive of human sexuality, and its civilizational trajectory. He looked at what he called sexual opportunities.
Meaning how freely and easily people could pursue immediate, uninhibited sexual gratification without societal boundaries.
Yes. And Unwin discovered something mathematically consistent across every single culture he studied.
It was.
When a society abandons structural constraints, when it maximizes sexual opportunities without any boundaries, seeking limitless, uninhibited self-gratification, it systematically dissipates what he called its creative energy.
I really want to understand the mechanism here, because it's one thing to state a fact, like what happens is that energy dissipates.
Right.
But I need to know how that happens. How exactly does regulating biological urges lead to building a civilization? And how does abandoning those regulations lead to collapse?
Let's bring in Sigmund Freud to explain the how, because Unwin's findings perfectly align with Freud's concept of sublimation.
Sublimation, right.
Think of raw human biological drive, the desire for gratification, for pleasure, for release, like a massive raging river.
Okay, I'm picturing a massive river of energy.
If you let that river flow everywhere, completely unconstrained, it spreads out, it floods the plains, it creates a vast, shallow swamp.
The swamp.
The water is there, the energy is there, but it has no force.
Mm-hmm.
It just sits there, consumed by the immediate environment. That is a society with zero structural constraints. All its energy is expended on immediate gratification.
Right. It just dissipates into the ground.
Exactly. Now, what happens if you build a dam? A structural constraint. You block the immediate flow. You frustrate the water.
The pressure builds.
The pressure builds, and then you channel that immense pressurized energy through a turbine. You sublimate it. You take raw biological energy and you convert it into a higher form of power, hydroelectric power.
Oh, that's good.
That power is what lights up cities. That power is what builds aqueducts, what writes philosophies, what forges complex trade routes, what drives scientific discovery.
That is a phenomenal analogy. So sublimation is the act of taking our deepest, most primal desires for immediate pleasure. And because society says, no, you cannot have that right now in whatever way you want, the human brain is forced to redirect that energy into building something lasting.
Exactly. Civilization itself is the product of delayed gratification.
Wow.
When a society removes all boundaries, when it tears down the dam and directs all its energy purely into immediate internal consumption and physical gratification, that sublimation completely stops. The turbine stops spinning.
Because why would I spend 20 years studying engineering or philosophy or trekking across a dangerous desert to establish a trade route if my society is structured to give me immediate, frictionless, unconstrained physical pleasure whenever I want it?
Precisely. They stop building. They stop maintaining their infrastructure. They stop looking outward to exchange with others. All their energy turns inward.
It makes perfect sense.
It's a profound sociological observation. An unconstrained society doesn't ascend to absolute freedom, as we might romantically assume. It descends into civilizational lethargy. It becomes the shallow swamp.
If we map this back onto the biological analogy we were talking about earlier, it's like a biological cell.
Yeah.
A healthy cell has a membrane. It lets nutrients in, it lets waste out, it engages in exchange. But the society Unwin is describing, and the city of Lot that Parwez is analyzing, is a cell whose membrane has hardened. It stops letting nutrients in.
And because it still needs energy?
The cell just starts cannibalizing its own organelles.
Cellular apoptosis.
Yes. It feels good in the short term, maybe.
Yeah.
It feels like maximum freedom. The cell is consuming itself without having to do the hard work of interacting with the outside world. But it's biological suicide. The cell is eating its own machinery to sustain a fleeting high.
And this brings us to the protagonist of the Quranic narrative. If the city is a cell eating itself, or an engine tearing itself apart, How do we understand the figure of Lot? Because if we are throwing out the religious sentimentality, we have to rethink who he is and what he's actually doing there.
Well, normally he's depicted as this deeply distressed, weeping preacher, a guy standing on a soapbox on the corner of the street, shouting at people to repent because an angry deity in the sky is going to punish them for their sins.
But in Parwez's structural framework, that image is entirely wrong. Lot is not a mystic. He is not a street preacher.
So what is he?
Lot is a systems engineer trying to trigger an emergency override on a machine that is in the red zone.
Let's look at the textual evidence for that. Let's look at his exact challenge to the community in verses 161 to 163.
Okay.
The standard formula he uses, which is repeated by multiple figures in this chapter, is, will you not exercise taqwa?
Now, let's pause here because this is where the translations often fail the modern reader. Conventionally, if you open almost any English translation of the Quran, taqwa is translated as fear of God or piety or righteousness.
Right, and if I am the skeptical listener, I'm saying, okay, so he is just a preacher telling them to be pious. How is that systems engineering? Isn't Parwez just twisting ancient mystical words to fit a modern 20th century sociological framework? Like, how can we trust this redefinition?
It's a crucial pushback. But Parwez isn't inventing a new meaning. He is returning to the classical Arabic root of the word.
Oh, really?
The root of taqwa is wki, which literally means to guard, to preserve, to shield, to protect from harm. It was originally used to describe a horse carefully placing its hooves to avoid stepping on sharp thorns.
Wow.
It is hypervigilance. It is systemic self-preservation.
So it's not an emotional state of fear, it's an active state of protection.
Exactly. When Lot asks, will you not exercise taqwa, he is not saying, will you not feel guilty? He is saying, do you not see the thorns? Do you not see that your system is mathematically unsustainable? Will you not activate your self-preservation protocol?
He's diagnosing them.
He is bringing them a rational argument based on the observable mechanics of their society. He's saying, look at the data. You are consuming yourselves. You're cutting off all external trade by exploiting every traveler. The caravans have stopped. Your energy is dissipating. You are going to crash.
That reframes the entire dynamic. He is the guy in the control room tapping the glass, pointing at the flashing red lights, saying the pressure is too high, open the intake valves.
Yes.
And how does the closed system respond to the engineer? Because this is incredibly telling about how echo chambers work.
If we cross-reference other verses in the Quran that detail their response to Lot, we see a fascinating psychological defense mechanism. They don't offer a counter-argument.
No.
They don't present economic data showing their extractive system is actually viable. They don't debate him on the merits of open versus closed borders.
No, they just resort to an ad hominem attack. They say, and I quote, expel Lot and his family from your city. They are people who keep themselves pure.
There are people who keep themselves pure. It is such a chilling, revealing line. Because to a deeply corrupted, perfectly sealed system, the presence of a healthy, functioning component isn't just an annoyance. No. It is perceived as an existential threat.
But why? I mean, if I have a broken engine and I put one working spark plug in it, the broken parts don't care. Why does human society react so violently to the healthy component?
Because human societies operate on narrative. And a closed system maintains its equilibrium through the tyranny of unproven assertions.
The tyranny of unproven assertions.
Yes. They rely on blind tradition, aggressive conformity, and the absolute normalization of their dysfunction. They have to believe that their way is the only way.
Right.
When someone is operating with taqwa, with systemic health, with open exchange, with boundaries, it shatters that illusion.
Yeah.
It holds up a mirror to the sickness of everyone else.
So they reject any rational dalil, any actual evidence. When Lot asks them for proof that their system won't collapse, they have none.
None at all.
So their only defense mechanism is a purge. They have to eject the reformer to protect the echo chamber.
Precisely. Which leads to a massive structural turning point in the text. In verses 168 and 169, Lot realizes that the emergency override has completely failed.
The system is locked.
The inertia is too great. He says to them, Inni liyamalakum mina al-qalin. I am one of those who utterly despise your practice. And then he turns away and says, Rabbi Najini, my Lord, save me.
Let's focus on that word qualin, because when I was reading Parwez's notes on this, he spent a lot of time on it. It's a vital linguistic distinction.
Yes. Parwez notes that qualin does not mean mild disagreement. It's not a polite difference of opinion. It's not Lot saying, hey guys, I personally don't love what you're doing, but we can agree to disagree. You do you, I'll do me.
Right. It's not a plea for tolerance.
Far from it. Qualin signifies an active, profound, irreconcilable rejection. It denotes a structural incompatibility that makes continued cohabitation mathematically and logically impossible.
It's like oil and water.
It is the realization that oil and water cannot mix, no matter how hard you shake the jar.
This completely changes how we view Lot's eventual departure from the city, because usually, when the story is told, his request to leave is painted as a kind of cowardly flight from persecution.
Yes, the escaping victim.
Like he's running away into the night because he's scared of the mob.
But read through the lens of systems engineering. It is a profound, calculated recognition. The engineer has run the diagnostic. He sees that the community has oriented its entire social architecture around the exploitation of outsiders.
He sees the crash coming.
He sees that the feedback loops are completely destroyed. He recognizes that a closed system of this magnitude cannot be reformed from within.
Because to reform it, they would have to open the borders, stop exploiting the travelers, and re-engage with the world. And they have violently refused to do that.
Exactly. So what is the only rational scientific response when you are standing inside an engine that is seconds away from a catastrophic thermodynamic failure and the crew refuses to open the cooling valves?
You hit the eject button, you walk away before the blast.
Yes, you exit. And this brings us to a detail in the text that totally shatters the traditional sentimental reading of this story. It's about who gets to exit with him.
This part is crucial.
Lot says, "Save me and my all," usually translated as my family. But what actually happens?
His biological wife is left behind while his ideological followers are saved. This is brutal.
It is.
I mean, if you're reading this as a sentimental family drama, it makes no sense. Why would a righteous man leave his wife to die?
Because the system of survival being outlined in this text doesn't care about biological bloodlines. It doesn't care about sentimental attachments or marriage certificates. It groups people by their ideological complicity. His wife, according to the broader Quranic narrative, was ideologically aligned with the closed system. She approved of the extractive nature of the city. She was comfortable in the swamp.
So she wasn't just geographically located in the city, she was part of the machine.
Precisely. Therefore, she was subject to the same mathematical laws of collapse as the rest of the machine. To save her would be to bring a piece of the diseased closed system out into the open, which defeats the entire purpose of the exit.
You know, it reminds me of a massive parallel earlier in this exact same chapter of the Quran. Surah 26 covers multiple historical events.
Yes, it's a structural masterpiece.
And in verse 52, it covers Moses exiting Pharaoh's Egypt. It's the exact same structural logic. Moses also reaches a point where he realizes the Egyptian system, which is built entirely on the extraction of slave labor and the hoarding of wealth, is structurally doomed.
He has the same wall.
He realizes he cannot vote his way out of it. He cannot politely protest his way to a new system.
There is a mathematical point of no return for these extractive societies.
Yes. When an engine's feedback loops are entirely destroyed, throwing more fuel at it or trying to patch it from the inside just causes a bigger explosion. The engineer has to recognize when a system is unsalvageable.
And that blast, the inevitable explosion of the unsalvageable system, is what we need to discuss next. Because how exactly does the collapse happen? In Parwez's framework, there is no magic involved. There's only what he calls the law of requital.
Mukafare amal.
Yes, the strict cause and effect universe. Mukafare amal is the core Quranic principle that the universe operates on natural, inescapable laws. Actions have inevitable, structural consequences. Every cause has an effect.
So if I drink poison, my stomach bleeding isn't God punishing me for drinking poison. It is the chemical structural consequence of the liquid interacting with my biology.
Exactly. There was no superstitious deity sitting on a cloud, getting angry and throwing lightning bolts down at people who misbehave.
Yeah.
The text is not describing an angry intervention. It's describing structural inevitability.
Let's apply this law of requital to the specific case study of Lot's city. Let's trace the causality. We have a city that has completely closed itself off from productive exchange. They have weaponized their borders. They intercept the caravans. They exploit the traveler. What are the thermodynamics of this civilization?
If we look at this through the lens of thermodynamics, it is breathtakingly clear. This city has created a system with zero external input.
None at all.
They are receiving no fresh information from the outside world. They are engaging in no cross-cultural trade. They are importing no new resources. It is the economic and informational equivalent of a perfectly sealed system.
For you listening, if it's been a while since high school physics, what does the second law of thermodynamics tell us about sealed systems? It dictates that closed systems inherently and unavoidably move toward maximum entropy. They move toward disorder, chaos, and eventual death.
Because without fresh energy entering the system, the existing energy simply degrades.
Right.
A community that refuses productive exchange with the wider world is not sustainable. It is forced to consume its own social capital, trust breaks down, infrastructure degrades, and because they have blocked all channels of external exchange, there is no mechanism for renewal.
This is where J.D. Unwin's data acts like a ticking clock on this phenomenon. We talked about how his research showed a drop in creative energy, but he also put a timeline on it.
He did.
Unwin found that once a society reaches this state of unconstrained, inward-focused dissipation of energy, completely lacking sublimation, and closed off to the world, it doesn't collapse overnight. The engine takes time to tear itself apart.
Yes. Unwin found it takes roughly 3 generations.
About 100 years.
Roughly a century. And the sources cite massive historical parallels to back this up. Look at the transition of ancient Rome. During the Roman Republic, you had high structural constraints, immense sublimation of energy, and massive external expansion and exchange.
They were building.
They built roads that connected the known world. They were an open, aggressively exchanging system.
But then you transition to the late Roman Empire.
Exactly. The late empire becomes obsessed with internal consumption, limitless self-gratification. The borders become defensive rather than expansive. They stop innovating.
And they just start extracting.
They start relying purely on extracting from the provinces without offering stability in return. They squandered their creative energy, and within a few generations of reaching that state, they plummeted into historical irrelevance. The system collapsed under its own weight.
Their roofs caved in.
Yes.
And the roof caved in is the perfect segue to decoding the climax of the Lot narrative, because for thousands of years, people have read the ending of the story, the famous Rain of Stones, as a literal, superstitious sky strike, a magical meteor shower sent by God to punish the wicked city. But Parwez reads it completely differently, doesn't he?
Stripped of the mythological overlay, the Rain of Stones is the Quran's compressed, highly poetic image of absolute systemic collapse. Think about what an ancient city is fundamentally made of.
Stones, walls, roofs, towers.
When a society rots from the inside out, when it has consumed all its internal energy and blocked all external resources, the infrastructure physically and socially fails. The walls crumble. The society literally falls apart on top of its citizens.
Wait, so what you're saying is the punishment wasn't sent from outside. It wasn't a meteor from space. The punishment was the society itself. They built a machine that was thermodynamically designed to crash, and then, well, it crashed.
Precisely. A community that extracts from visitors rather than exchanging with them, eventually, has nothing left to extract from. Word gets out. The caravans stop coming. The travelers route around the city.
The intake valve goes dry.
And internally, because they have abandoned all structural constraints, they have nothing left to offer each other but exploitation.
The social trust is completely gone.
The economic base is gone. The creative energy is gone. So the physical and social structures literally collapse on their heads. It rains stones because the city they built is falling apart from a lack of maintenance and a lack of social cohesion. The law of requital fulfills itself perfectly.
Okay, I want to zoom out here. Because if we step back and look at the entirety of Surah 26, the genius of this text really comes into focus. And I mean genius in the most analytical sense of the word. We've been deep in the weeds on the Lot narrative, but we have to look at the grand design.
Yes, the comparative analysis.
Exactly. If Lot's society crashed because it walled off its borders, it makes me wonder about the other civilizations mentioned in this exact same chapter. Because the Lot case study isn't an isolated story, it is the fourth civilizational pathology presented in a sequence.
Right.
Did the other cities make the exact same mistake?
This is where the structural brilliance of the text shines. It's not just a collection of random stories. It is giving us a taxonomy of civilizational failure. 4 different case studies, 4 different symptoms, but one underlying disease.
Let's frame this as a mystery for the listener and see if we can spot the pattern, because it builds a devastating diagnostic manual. First, the text gives us Noah's community. What was their failure mode? According to Parwez's reading, they failed via epistemological suppression.
Meaning, they chose blind reliance on biological bloodlines and ancestral traditions over shared rational ideology.
Right.
When presented with new, corrective information, they violently rejected it because it threatened their established worldview. They refused to update their knowledge.
Okay, so that's civilization number one, dying of ignorance by choice. Then the text moves to the community of Ad. What was their pathology?
Ads suffered from permanence delusion. They built massive hubristic monuments. They hoarded immense wealth. And they used that wealth to crush the weak.
Oh, wow.
They operated under the absolute delusion that they were invincible, that their wealth made them permanent. And because of that arrogance, they lost the ability to course correct. They thought they were too big to fail.
Civilization number two, dying of arrogance. Third, we get the community of Thamud. And this one is fascinating because it's deeply economic. Their pathology was the privatization of common productive resources.
Yes. The narrative of Thamud centers around a she-camel and a water source. Stripped of mythology, it is a story about a ruling elite monopolizing the life-sustaining resources of the society.
They cut off access.
They cut off access to the basic means of survival for the vulnerable, creating extreme, unsustainable inequality.
Civilization number three, dying of internal economic strangulation. And finally, we arrive at the fourth case study, Lot's community. And their failure mode, as we've spent this time unpacking, was closure to external productive exchange and the systemic physical exploitation of the stranger.
So if we look at the board, we have epistemological suppression, permanence delusion, resource privatization, and border weaponization. Four entirely different symptoms.
But what is the underlying law of survival that connects them all?
The master conclusion of Surah 26 is that every single one of these case studies is a different failure mode of the exact same underlying requirement. A social system must remain open to corrective signals.
Boom. That's it. It has to stay open.
It is a biological, thermodynamic, and sociological imperative. Whether those corrective signals come from an internal reformer like Noah trying to bring new knowledge, or Hud trying to humble Ad, or Sally trying to redistribute Thamud's water, or Lot trying to open the borders, or whether those signals come from external exchange, like the traveler, the stranger, the outside world. If you block the signal, you die.
Stripped of the narrow, misleading sexual ethics framing, this text reveals itself to be an absolute masterclass in systems analysis. A community with no productive relationship to the outside world, whether they've walled themselves off through intellectual arrogance, economic monopoly, or violent physical exploitation, loses access to the information, the resources, and the adaptive capacity required to survive in a changing universe.
This brings us to a concept Parwez frequently discusses, and it's perhaps the most terrifying concept in his work: the epistemologically captured heart.
What does that mean in this context?
It's the ultimate psychological and structural description of a closed system. It is a mind or an entire society that aggressively, systematically filters out every single piece of data that does not confirm what it already believes. It is a system that has made learning literally impossible.
Because to learn, you have to admit you are currently wrong. You have to let a stranger into your mind.
Exactly. And as Surah 26 proves across four vastly different, meticulously detailed historical civilizations, the structural endpoint of epistemologically captured system is always the exact same.
Total collapse, maximum entropy, the rain of stones.
The law of requital guarantees that you cannot cheat thermodynamics and you cannot cheat the social dynamics of human energy.
This is immense. If you are listening right now, whether you're prepping for a boardroom meeting or studying history or just looking at the news, think about the weight of what we've just unpacked. You now have a totally different framework to look at the world. You don't have to look at the rise and fall of nations or corporations or even relationships as a series of mystical moral failings or angry deities punishing sinners. You can look at them as thermodynamic systems, systems of energy exchange and feedback loops.
It demands that we look at our own structures with cold, analytical, mathematical clarity. Are the intake valves open? Is the system exchanging or just extracting?
Which leaves us with a massive and frankly deeply uncomfortable question to chew on as we wrap this up.
Always the best way to end.
Right. If ancient texts were actually warning us, using highly sophisticated allegories and precise linguistic diagnostics, about the inevitable collapse of closed extractive systems, what does that mean for our modern world?
That is the essential, terrifying question of our time.
Because we pride ourselves on being the open system, right? We are more technologically connected than at any point in human history. We can talk to anyone, anywhere, instantly. The borders of information seem completely open.
But look at what we are actually building with that technology.
Exactly. We constantly construct massive algorithmic echo chambers. We design social media platforms that are essentially machines built to create epistemologically captured hearts. They feed us only what we already believe.
And they actively filter out any corrective signals that might cause cognitive dissonance.
And economically, we participate in hyper-extractive digital economies. These platforms view the stranger, the user on the other end of the screen, not as a human being to engage in productive exchange with, but purely as a data point to be consumed, exploited, and monetized for immediate gratification.
We are trapping the traveler in the digital desert. We are extracting their attention, their data, their energy, and offering nothing of substantive, lasting value in return.
It's a haunting parallel. The architecture might be digital algorithms instead of stone walls, but the thermodynamic laws remain exactly the same. The dissipation of creative energy is happening right in front of us.
The machine is humming. The friction is building.
The question is, are the valves actually open, or have we just painted a picture of an open window on a sealed iron vault? Are we, right now, with all our brilliant technology, simply engineering the ultimate closed system?
If we are, the law of requital is already in motion. The stones are already falling.
Keep questioning the structures around you. Challenge your own epistemological capture. Keep the intake valves of your own mind wide open. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.